Allow me at the outset to welcome you for the final lectures of the Pourdavoud Center in Iranian Antiquity for this academic year. It gives me great pleasure to conclude this year's Pourdavoud lecture series with the contribution of my esteemed colleagues, Miguel John Versluys, Professor of Classical and Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and presently a Getty Scholar at the Villa, as well as Ab de Jong, Professor of the Study of Religion at the University of Leiden as well, whom I shall have the pleasure of introducing more amply later in the program. I would also like to seize this moment to thank our colleagues at the Getty, especially Alexa Sekura, Head of the Scholars Program at the Research Institute, Jeffrey Spears, Head Curator at the Villa, and Tim Potts, the Director's Museum, for graciously facilitating the academic exchanges between the Getty and the Pourdavoud Center this academic year. Exchanges that owed also to the fortunate concurrence of the center's inauguration and the choice of ancient Persia as a theme of Getty's innovative programming on the classical world in context. Professor Versluys' research and teaching focuses on empire, culture encounters, and globalization, in particular through the exploration of the dynamic processes in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Not only does the Eurasian context figure prominently in his work, but also do the multiple layers wherein cultural processes may be investigated, that is, both the local and regional and global perspectives. He's certainly known for the innovative use of methodological departures from the social and exact sciences in his historical approaches. Among Professor Versluys' many valuable contributions, I would like to mention his excellent book on Egyptiaca Romana, the Nilotic scenes and the Roman views of Egypt, published in 2002 with Brill, and his most recent monograph on the Commagenian kingdom, Visual Style and Constructing Identity in the Hellenistic World, Nemrud Dağ and Commagene under Antiochus I, published with Cambridge in 2017, which is now a required read for the exploration of the Persian and Hellenistic kingdom of the Commagene. Among more recent and worthwhile publications, I should mention his Globalization and the Roman World, World History, Connectivity and Material Culture, co-edited with M. Pitts and published in Cambridge University in 2015, as well as, my favorite obviously, Persianism in Antiquity, which was jointly prepared with Rolf Strootman and treats the reception of all things Achaemenid in the world of antiquity. In his lecture today, Miguel John shall be elaborating on the concept of Persianism and its discontent by discussing the famous late Hellenistic site of Nemrud Dağ in the kingdom of Commagene, which was bordered on the east by the Euphrates River. Now, there is by far more to what Miguel John has done. He has 10 edited volumes. I cannot really mention them. He has won great many very prestigious grants from the NWO. And if I were to mention all of them, I think there would be an unsettling sense of depression among others. So just know that he is a most admirable scholar, and his achievements are indeed truly remarkable. Please welcome him to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rahim. Still, the good thing is that getting in money has nothing to do with quality, so that was about the money, but now, hopefully, let's talk about also the quality. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be here amongst you, to share some things and also to pose some questions together. So I'm a classical and Mediterranean archaeologist, and then I came up with this idea about Persianism. And the idea about Persianism was really a question. So I did extensive fieldwork in Commagene between 2001 and 2004. So this is one of the things we did over there, the famous reliefs. We got them into a restoration laboratory. I also had to write a monograph about the subject. And in developing this monograph, a lot of problems came up. And one of the problems was that it looked like classical archaeologists were not very able to make sense of the Persian or so-called Persian elements they saw at Nemrud Dağ. For the Greek elements, it was not so difficult, actually. People talked about Hellenism, We are in the 1st century BC, so it's not really Hellenization. Greece was not something in political terms anymore at this time. But we know very well from Jewish studies, but from a lot of different disciplines, we know the concept of Hellenism. Could it be true that there was also something like Persianism then? I wondered. And I thought that there should be many books about it. Many French theoretical books, many German catalogues probably. But there were no German catalogues and there were no French philosophers talking about Persianism. And therefore we organized a conference in Istanbul, where I met Rahim for the first time, where Abde Jong, my Leiden colleague, was also there, where together, so scholars dealing with the Hellenistic world, but also with the world of Iran, with Central Eurasia, Western Eurasia, we debated this concept of Persianism. And I think that was extremely useful. So what I would like to do today with you is explain what Persianism is about, but also hopefully in the debate, because there is debate, go one step further. Does the concept really work? Is it worthwhile to talk in terms of Persianism? And might Persianism also be a concept that works well for the, let's say, eastern parts of Eurasia? So I myself am very much focused on the Mediterranean. I first worked on the interactions between the Mediterranean and Egypt. Then through my fieldwork in Commagene, I moved eastwards. But I'm not a Near Eastern scholar. So actually, I should not be here, you might well say. But I hope to show in my lecture that those worlds are, of course, much more entangled and much more intertwined than we always think, which might have also interesting consequences for what the Pourdavoud Center is actually for. So first I will give a very brief introduction about the allure and eternal return of Persia. Then I briefly have to comment very briefly on my two central concepts, and that is Mnemohistory and related to that Persianism. Then I will present you my case study, which is largely taken from my book, Nemrud Dağ and Late Hellenistic Commagene, and then I will share with you some thoughts, but also some uncertainties about what Persianism is about. So these two books, just to convince you of the fact that there is a reason why I really have at least some right to stand before you. Okay, let's start with this wonderful picture. This is a painting by Mir Kalan Khan from the end of the 18th century. And as you see, we are over here in a beautiful landscape where you see two lovers, and the lovers, they are sitting next to a river. Sorry, the picture was a little bit clearer on my own screen. And if you see over here, there are all kinds of animals also dealing with one another. So a very bucolic sphere, you could say. And at the other side of the river, there is this figure. You can see her in detail over here. And it's a female musician who is playing music. She's sitting at the other side of the water. So a very wonderful and bucolic atmosphere, you could say. On closer inspection, however, we see that actually maybe something else is going on. As you all might have recognized, the styles of the figures are very different. There are several different styles used in this picture. So the lovers are depicted, you could say, in a very Persian Safavid style, which reminds us of Isfahan in the 17th century. So they have very broad white faces as they are praised in the Persian poetry of the period. Now the musician is very differently depicted. She's depicted in a typically Mughal style, you could say, which was very popular at the period. And then even at the very right side of the picture over here, you see a kind of wood forest depicted in a very naturalistic European style. So what seems to be one composition, if we go a little bit more in depth, we actually see that it's built up out of three different visual, or we could maybe call them semantic formula. Now, it has not been easy for scholars, and that is my point, to understand this picture. Even if we look at the catalogue of the Copenhagen Museum where it's now, the catalogue talks about mongrel sensibilities, and the words hybridity and eclecticism are used in a very negative sense. Now, in what is a wonderful book, and I only, of course, read this book because I bought it looking at the Rembrandt exhibition, so this is why being at the Getty really helps a lot. And this wonderful book by Kavita Singh, she analyzed it in a very different way. And she says what we have here are two different layers of reality. So here we have a singer, and we know through the gesture she makes with the hand that she is reciting somebody. And this is a singer who tells a story, who sings about a couple in the past, in a kind of Persianate past, that fall in love and where all kinds of things happen. So this is not a scene with people interacting. This is a scene, this is the teller, and this is the song, you could say. So a Persian style here is used actually to evoke an exotic world of refined luxury, and in this case also erotic luxury. Now, these kinds of what we could call Persianisms, because they are references to a kind of Persian world which has little to do with the reality. It's really about something else. It's about the past. It's maybe about memory. We will discuss that. They are very popular in Mughal paintings from the earliest beginning. And we know exactly in this case why that is. Because around 1550, the Persian masters from the Safavid school, they were relocated to the Mughal court. And this resulted in a fascinating process of interaction with Indian traditions. So they thought something was to be gained from there, and they really took them and they brought them to their own court. That's something, Margaret, unfortunately, we cannot say about your case, but it would be wonderful having Persians in Athens or the other way around. But here we can prove that it worked like that. Another major influence, and this is what Mughal painting makes a fascinating example of how cultural interaction works with relation to style and material culture, are European prints. So really India in the period got through the Jesuit missionaries, got overflown, you could say, with European prints that had a very different style, a very different way of depicting perspective, for instance. And therefore immediately they integrated the European influences in their own style. So actually we have here a kind of Persianism. This is Mughal painting, and this is clearly a reference to how in European prints in the period, forests were depicted in a kind of naturalistic way. Now a very early example, sorry, also this looked better on my own slide, is this opaque watercolor that shows us a Shah Salim, who is enthroned. And it is made by two Indian artists, one called Mansoor, that was the illuminator, and the other called Manohar, who was the painting around 1600. Now, as you can see, the ornate Persian-style throne almost dwarfs the Shah. It's wonderful, because the object almost overtakes the person, you could say. And it's meant, of course, to suggest a connection between Shah Salim and the legendary mythical Persian king Jamshid and his famed bejeweled throne. So also this, I would argue, is a kind of Persianism, a reference to an idea that is tied up with Persia and that is used in this context for own reasons. Now, two different forms of Persianism, they show, I think, how multifaceted the concept was in the early modern periods. How it was part of something new through meanings it had acquired over time, and that's an important point, how it was able to innovate. In both examples I briefly discussed, we see that Persian elements are added to a cultural constellation that is actually renewed through this addition. Mughal painting could not exist without these references to Persia, but also not without references to European naturalism. And this brings me to, these two examples bring me to the second part of my paper. And those are the two concepts that we should really briefly discuss before we start talking about my case study, about Nemrud Dağ. Now, I already mentioned the word Mnemohistory. It's very important to pronounce it correctly, not as Nemo history, because that's... But Mnemohistory is something fundamentally different from how people normally perceive historical processes to work. So you could say that there are two modes of access to the past. The one is historical, and that's the one we're all used to, but the other is mnemohistorical. Now, the historical way aims at investigating and reconstructing past events or conditions, situations, as they really were or happened. And they are exploring all kinds of contemporary sources. Now, the mnemohistorical approach, on the other hand, asks for the past not as it really happened, but as it was and is remembered. Mnemohistory, therefore, is actually the history of memory. But here too, if we discuss the history of memory, an important distinction has to be made. Because, and it's mainly the fascinating work by the Egyptologist Jan Assmann that has showed it, the past is not only remembered by later generations. It also exerts by itself an influence on later times. We cannot choose our own past. Now, the German terminology distinguishes between what you call in German Rezeptionsgeschichte, so it's the history of reception. But there is also something which is called Wirkungsgeschichte. And Wirkungsgeschichte are the legendary reverberations, you can say, that have a kind of agency of their own. So it's not only that you can choose your own tradition, there are also traditions that haunt us, you could say. Now, originally, of course, both terms derive from literary discourse, and they refer to different ways of dealing with classical texts. Wirkungsgeschichte attributes their afterlife, you could say, mainly to the texts themselves, and that's what makes it very interesting, I think, and very interesting for objects, as I will discuss. So, a text like the Iliad by Homer is still read by readers of our time, not because they are interested, being modern readers, in Greek epic poetry, but to the enormous intrinsic qualities of the text that did and do not fail to impress readers of all times. Now, Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher and the most prominent theorist of Wirkungsgeschichte, he calls this property of classical text their, it's always more beautiful in German, their unmittelbare Sagkraft, so their immediate communicative power. And that's, of course, what the Iliad shows, very much. There's also a very interesting argument to make about Egyptian objects and their unmittelbare Sagkraft that nobody is able to escape from. Now, immediacy, this Sagkraft, can be understood as widely independent from any mediating institutions, such as schools, teachers, literary critics, commentaries, etc. Now, Rezeptionsgeschichte, more traditional on the other hand, attributed this afterlife of classical text, for instance, to the reader and mediating institutions in the first place, without whom there would be no afterlife at all. Now, this distinction between reception history and Wirkungsgeschichte may also apply to the past in general. That an event or a period is remembered for centuries to come may be due to its lasting importance. Examples are the Reformation, the Age of Enlightenment, or the French Revolution. The philosopher Kant beautifully phrased it as follows. He said, "Ein solches Phänomen vergisst sich nicht mehr." So it's not about us choosing to forget the Reformation. No, the Reformation will always be there because it's so important from itself that it will continue to haunt us. So those things have lasting importance, you could say. So mnemohistory, and that's an important point, is thus not about authentic knowledge, but about how a certain concept, in our case Persia, served as a mirror of societies and cultures throughout time, fulfilling, of course, a myriad different roles in a myriad different contexts, but always in one way or another coming back to the concept of Persia. And actually we have the same thing with Egypt in a way. And it's also about the very active role, the haunting character, the eternal return, you could almost say, of those concepts. Okay. Just keep this in mind. So, mnemohistory, very different from history. The big mistake people always make is that, for instance, if Greek writers write about Persia or about Egypt, that classical scholars say, well, they were wrong. They are not really understanding what went on in the Achaemenid Empire or in the Egyptian world. That's not the point. The interesting thing is how they remember and why they remember and what that says about their own society. And it took us 2 or 3 generations, I think, to find it out. So there are many articles saying, but what Herodotus says about this or that, it's totally wrong because they did it differently. That's not the point. Huh? The point is why Herodotus thinks that Persians do this or that. And that is very viable information. That is Mnemohistory. If you apply Mnemohistory to Persianism, and actually this became much more clear for me only after having edited the book, that what we have actually done is the Mnemohistory of Persia in the long term. So ideas and associations revolving around the concept of Persia and of course appropriated in specific contexts for specific reasons. Gard Fowden once wonderfully phrased it as the whole post-Achaemenid antiquity was in a way living in the shadow of Cyrus. It's a little bit like that. So how Persia was remembered, imagined, reinvented, appropriated, and how it acquired strength through these metamorphoses. I think that's a good new definition with which I found up. Okay, after theory, let's do some archaeology. My experience in the archaeology of the Middle East or Central Eurasia is very limited. Real specialists like Vito Messina can tell you much more about it and has much more experience. I worked in Commagene only for several years on a very big international project that has as one of its main aims to make necessary restorations to the monument of Nemrud Dağ. Commagene is located at the upper Euphrates. It's now in Turkey, southeast Turkey, Kurdistan, some people would say. But it's very important to realize that in antiquity, this was seen as northern Syria. So we have a lot of descriptions, and also in terms of the, let's say, the morphology of the area, it very much belongs to, also culturally, to what happens over here. So you can see it as Anatolian archaeology, but northern Syria is actually better to understand it. We're dealing with a very small kingdom where there are several sites, so I will talk extensively about Nemrud Dağ or Nemrud Dağ that you see over here, very much in the northern part of the kingdom where the Taurus Mountains already start. A city you will have heard of is Samosata or Samosata, where Lucian, of course, came from. Here is Dolige, which is well known for the German excavation from the Forschungsstelle Asia Minor. And here is the famous city of Zeugma, which was one of the most important crossings over the Euphrates. When you came, let's say, here from the Middle East and you wanted to go to Anatolia, there were not very many crossings, and Zeugma was a very important one. It's also well known for the rescue excavations, because Zeugma is now under the waters of the Atatürk barrage, and therefore there were rescue excavations in the 80s and the 90s. So a very small kingdom at a very strategic position, you could say. I show you this strategic position. So here once again, Nemrud, Samosata, Zeugma, which was a Seleucid founding. So it's Mesopotamia over here, but therefore also included, this is the Mediterranean. So it's very close over there as well. And if you look at the map of Eurasia, we are over here. Now, I will mainly talk about Nemrud Dağ and show you some other slides. Nemrud is over here, but it's very. So the Taurus Mountains start over here, and Nemrud is really at the beginning of the Taurus Mountains. But it's very important for you to realize that I will describe a kind of set of visual culture that we encounter on Nemrud Dağ, and that in my book I've tried to explain. But, and this is fundamental, this repertoire of material culture, very standardized, that we will see, occurs throughout the whole kingdom. So we have similar things throughout this whole kingdom. You see the kingdom over here, and everywhere where are these barbecues. I'm not allowed to say that from my students, these barbecues. You see, those are small cult places where we have a similar type of material culture that also relates to the cult of Antiochus I. So I'm talking about Nemrud Dağ. There's no time now to cover all the different sites, but you have to realize that apparently it was the intention of this monarch to create a kind of grid, you could say, over the whole of Commagene. Now here we approach the sanctuary, and there you already see that visibility is very much key to what happens over there. So what we have is not the highest mountain peak, but one of the most visible, you could say. So he really made a keen decision where to put his temple tomb, his hierothesion, as he called it. And what they did, so it's mostly natural, but they hacked out terraces, and from the hacked out stone they made it into gravel, and the gravel they put back on the terraces. So what you see is not a tumulus that is totally made up of gravel, but it's only a layer of gravel on the terraces. It makes that the monument is visible from afar. So we tried it from all kinds of sides, but for wherever you come, also from the Tigris, from 50, 60 kilometers, you can see this very distinctive peak, which is of course remarkable. Here we're already rather close. Okay, what do we have at Nemrud Dağ? We have the tumulus, we already discussed it. So here you see it in that, the photograph from the 1950s when Teresa Goel was excavating over there. And here you see the natural rock under the layer of gravel, as I explained. These are the old maps made in the 1950s. This is a new map that we made with the International Nemrud project, much more in detail, but the elements are the same. So we have a tumulus over here, and around the tumulus we have two terraces, which are called, very prosaically, the East Terrace and the West Terrace. There might also be a North Terrace, but it's not really clear if this is a terrace, and if it was a terrace, it has not been finished. We will leave it for now. Important to realize once again that at these terraces we have similar elements. So we will see a row of colossal, very big statues of gods and animals, and of the king who puts himself amidst the gods. And at the left side and the right side here, there are so-called ancestor galleries. There might have been a Feueraltar over here, because it was the idea, of course, that there were Zoroastrians over here, and if you want Zoroastrians, you need a fire altar. And we have looked at that in depth. It's not really clear what was there. So there was a structure excavated by Teresa Goel in the 50s, but it's not really clear if it was an altar at all, and it's largely reconstructed. It's very convenient though, because if you want to land with a helicopter on Nemrud Dağ, you can do it on the fire altar over there. So it was a good idea maybe to restore it, but it's not original, so actually you should forget it. So we have here the row of statues before the tumulus, and here there were all kinds of reliefs, and here there were ancestor galleries. We see exactly the same elements at the Western Terrace, but as you see, it was a little bit smaller. It's a little bit differently located. So we have the big statues over here. They are totally tumbled down. We will see this. We have reliefs next to it, and the ancestor galleries, they are here and they are over here, making the terrace into a kind of square, you could say. We will see what the impression is. Now this is of course where Nemrud is very famous for. Who has visited the site? Who's over here? Oh yeah, wonderful, yeah. So you will not, of course, you will never forget it probably. When was this, Liz?
Well, I've been there I think about 5 or 6 years.
Ah, a specialist.
1989.
Okay. So,
The last time I was there was 2014 with the National Museum.
okay. So then you've seen the old situation, because we altered some things at the site, but you will see. So this was the old situation, and one of the things we did, it was a lot of practical work. So as you can see here, so this is the shoulder piece of the Apollo, and that was just resting on one stone. So really, and sometimes tourists were sitting on it. So this could fall down. So, well, what we did is stabilization, and also, for instance, stabilization of this statue. If you see over here, the cracks were enormous, so one more small earthquake and it would have come down. So what we did, we basically stabilized the base of this statue, and it was torn down, we restored the base, and then we built it up in exactly the same as it was. There was a big debate if we should put the hats on. 3 conferences, and we decided, of course, not to do it, because if you have to do it, you have to stabilize it, so you have to make the hats part of the statue, and when there is a real earthquake, then the whole statue will come down. So we decided to restore in a non-interventionist way. Now, this is, of course, what the monument is famous for. If you come here at sunset or sunrise, it's, of course, an incredible impression. They are 6 to 9 meters high. But what's most interesting for us now is their names. There is a text at the back of the statues, and the text tells us that these are these gods. So we have the king Antiochus, and then we have Commagene, a personification. Then we have Zeus Oromastes, Ahura Mazda. Then we have Apollo Mithras Helios Hermes, and over here we have, recognizable by the club, Artagnes Heracles Ares. And there are every time a lion and an eagle at the side of these statues. So here you see the site as it is nowadays, and I like this picture. So here's the so-called foyer altar, which is not a fire altar. Here, the heads of the statues that we now put in top, that we put in front of the statue, that you can see where it goes. So you see that it was really a kind of square, which was, well, quite intimate, you could say, because there are big reliefs standing over here, there were reliefs standing over here, and then you looked up the mountain and you saw the king and the gods. We know these names through what is called the nomos, which means law in Greek, and that's a very interesting text, written as the Greek newspaper. People were speaking Aramaic, so it's very interesting that we have Greek over here, in which this Antiochos explains us what this monument is about. So he literally says, at the end of my life, I decided to build this monument. I build it for the whole of mankind because it's very important, and I need plots of lands for the priest, and 2 times a month you have to come here on my birthday and the birthday of my wife to celebrate. And if you celebrate, you have to dress up as Persian priests. That's very important, and etc., etc. So it's one big ego document, you could say, about how we should understand this monument. That has given us a lot of problems. Because, and I don't dare to say this because I see professors of classics over here, classicists tend to be rather naive when it concerns texts. So what most classicists have done, they have taken this text and used it as historical sources. Everything we know about this kingdom and about this guy, we know from this guy. So it's not very reliable information, I would say. We will come back to that when we discuss Achaemenid. First, we are here at the Osteras, so here the statues, here the ancestor galleries that we will see, and in front of it there were reliefs. They have not been preserved over here, but they have been excavated in small pieces have been excavated, so we know they existed, but they have been very well preserved at the West Terrace. So we can use this to reconstruct the East Terrace. And one of the most famous examples, of course, of these reliefs is the lion horoscope. This lion horoscope animated a lot of debate when it was found at the end of the 19th century, because in terms of style people could not make sense of it. It was Greek, but Greek with an Asiatischen Geschmack, as Humann and Puchstein have it, because it is not really Greek in a way. It's a very interesting document because it shows a specific constellation, and we can calculate that constellation. That has been done. There is a lot of debate about it, because this is the lion, and these are different planets and moons. So it's very difficult, but you can. There are 2 or 3 dates that range from 130 BC until 70 BC that might be the dates related to this so-called lion horoscope. And what is very interesting, this is the original, which is rather damaged, as you can see. But when the monument was discovered by Humann and Puchstein at the end of the 19th century, they made an Abklatsch, and that is in Berlin in the museum. And this is what Jeffrey and I have been talking about. So we have a better copy than the original. That's what is interesting. So here you see what the reliefs have looked like. So this is the West Terrace, but we know that these were on the East Terrace. Here we have the famous lion horoscope. Again, we have lions and eagles. And then we see, also very remarkable, everything about this monument is remarkable, the dexiosis reliefs. So dexiosis means that you shake hands. And every time we see a king, a monarch, shaking hands with the 4 gods. So here shaking hands with Heracles, here with Zeus Oromastes, here with Apollo, and here with Commagene. Totally gone. Here you see them a little bit more in detail. This is the Commagene one, this is also Abklatsch gone, and this is the Apollo one. And now you also see very clearly why people have struggled with the style of the monument. Because also already the lion has an Asiatism geschmack. But this, of course, is typically, this is the Armenian tiara, but here you see typically Persian or quasi-Achaemenid, you could say, clothing, characterizing both the king and the god himself. Now, this so-called, what you could call a double stemma, also is very visible from these ancestor reliefs. These were big reliefs that were standing here in these sockets, and these are altars before it. They have been preserved like this, and here the king presents us with his genealogy. And what does he say? From the side of my mother, I come from Darius, and from my father, I go back to Darius, and from the side of my mother, through the Seleucids, I go back to Alexander the Great. So this is what he presents us with. There are inscriptions behind, and a large part of the literature on this monument is about which relief exactly is what kind of ancestor. So if you want to really spoil your summer, you have to read all the German articles with reconstruction of the text, and we can say very little about it. So you see here, sorry, maybe it's not very clear, but the red things, they are preserved, and the other are so we know that it looks a little bit like this. But in general, and therefore I started with the reconstruction, it must have been extremely impressive, of course, because they are about 2 meters high. So at the left of the right, you had this row of Persians, and then the row of Seleucids, going back to Alexander, going back to Darius, and then you had the reliefs in front of you, and then you had the statues over there, and then the tumulus. So it must have been incredibly impressive. And there is, of course, a big debate if they were depicted or not, and then in what kind of colors, but we don't know that. These are the heads of the statues. The east terrace, they are standing. The west terrace has totally fallen down. And I have once spent a summer, a very useful summer, looking if all the blocks on the west terrace are still there. And the answer is yes. So for every block we can say it belongs to this statue over there. So potentially we could reconstruct them. That was another conference, and then it was decided not to do this. Here you see a very practical, almost archaeological problem, but also a heritage problem. The gravel on the monument had slowly rolled over all the things that were on the terraces and also has preserved them. Some things were, you could say, laying free at the end of the 19th century, but this was only done by Teresa Goel in the 1950s. That's wonderful, so now we see much more. But the problem is, in the winter, it's totally under snow. And when the snow melts, water comes from the tumulus down and penetrates into this rather vulnerable stone. And then it freezes again in winter. So the cracks you see, it's a very big problem, because it's water that has become part of the stone is then freezing. So if we don't do anything, they will not be there anymore over 30 or 40 years, because they're really blowing up themselves, you could say. Here you see the ancestor reliefs when they were still standing over there at the site. So here this is enigmatic, because this is the king himself with the towers in the background, and this is of course Commagene personification. So here we have the west terrace, you see, so the statues, they were there, but they have totally been tumbled down. Okay, I've been mentioning his name already several times, so we're talking about Antiochus I, who lived from roughly 70 BC to 36 BC. He tells us that his father is Mithridates I Kallinikos. We have some other historical sources about him. Samos II would come before, and a certain Ptolemaios, and he would be the first one to break free from the Seleucids and to found this independent kingdom. We will not talk about the later phases, Jake, I'm sorry about that, because that's very interesting, because especially this figure, Julius Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which you might know from his monument in Athens, so the Philopappos monument. And the interesting thing is, apparently they are very well in maintaining all kinds of ties, being a kind of cultural brokers, because in the end the Romans will take over the empire, but the empire will be given back. You see there is a gap between 17 AD and 38 AD. It will be given back in 38 BC to this Epiphanes, 38 AD, apologies, to this Epiphanes, with all the tax revenues from the years in between, that it was Roman. And then Commagene suddenly becomes independent again. Very interesting story, but not part of this talk. This is Teresa Goel, a remarkable Jewish woman who went to the monument for the first time in the 1930s and got really under the spell of the monument. She went back with some grants of the National Geographic Society in the 50s because she did not have a permanent position, I think, at New York University, and she did wonderful work over there. The problem was that she never published it. So the big monograph on Nemrud Dağ was edited by Donald Sanders and published in 1996. So in the meantime, she had published quite some things about it, also in terms of interpretation, but there was not a real monograph, and that has hampered the interpretation a lot. What was very interesting is that Goel was very much arguing for the originality, you could say, of the monument, because that had been a big problem. So you have to realize it was discovered in 1890, then it was debated quite intensively, so many people wrote about it, especially in terms of the history of religion. So what is it actually that we have over here? But then apparently it was forgotten again, you could say. And that has to do with the fact that the monument did not belong to a tradition, you could say. So for classical archaeologists, it was much too, well, it was late Hellenistic, it was provincial, and it was also, it looked Persian. So it was not Greek at all, so they did not like it. The interesting thing is that it was also the case from Near Eastern archaeology. Somebody like Giersman, for instance, discussed it, but he said, well, it's clearly Parthian, but very, very at the edge of the Parthian world and very much influenced by this Greek. So nobody liked it because it was so eclectic. Goel was the first one who really liked it, but maybe not for the right reasons. She very much came under the spell of the monument. She wanted to find the tomb of Antiochus I. We did not talk about that, but it's a temple tomb, so the tomb of the guy should be somewhere, because he says in the inscription, so therefore it's true. It might be true that the tomb is not really there. We know from the pyramid, for instance, there are a lot of descriptions, and the pharaohs were buried elsewhere. That might be here the case as well. But Goel really started looking for the tomb of the king, and that might be one of the reasons why she did not publish her findings. Her conceptual idea of the originality was to say it's Anatolian, and therefore she stressed very much the Hittites. Predecessors, you could say, of these temple tombs. So Gordion was very important for her. She said this is an Anatolian tradition, actually. So which is absolutely not true, I think, because it's much too general an argument. So the point is, and in my book I had to write a big chapter about that, everybody tries to make the monument part of her own cultural tradition. It's Greek, but then very late and to Persian. Or it's Parthian, but then very Greek and very much in the Western world. Or it's Anatolian Hittite, but then very late. So nobody takes the monument seriously, I think, for what it is, which I try to do in my book. As a kind of historical background, Rahim, what?
You have time.
Well, it's 10 minutes, yeah. The background, yes, sorry, I still get very much excited when I talk about this, but I will. It's a fantastic. So this is the Seleucid Empire. We know our Seleucus, of course, and then what happens is that it shrinks very quickly, and then Rome comes from the east. So you see here Rome conquering all kinds of parts of the Hellenistic East, but not really being there until Augustus. Of course, you cannot talk about a structure, about Romanization in this sense. So this means the period we are in, the first century BC, is one of the most interesting periods for me in the history of the ancient world, because it's one big chaos. The Roman Empire is not really there. The Seleucids are not there anymore, and therefore there is a lot of room for interesting guys like Tigranes here with a wonderful portrait in the Louvre to do their own thing. And apparently this Antiochus had room, but also had money, had the means to do his own thing. And what he developed, I think, was a very interesting project of bricolage. Before I will comment on that any further, briefly some look at what happened in the other parts of the kingdom. So Nemrud Dağ over here, but another very famous site where a lot of German research has been going on is called Achaemenid. Here we have Achaemenid, and there we have the most famous explorer, I think, together with Goel, of Commagene in the 20th century, and that's Friedrich Karl Dörner, who was a professor of ancient history in Münster, and therefore now in Münster we still have the Forschungsstelle Asia Minor, from where all the Commagene work actually is coordinated, you could say. As it goes, Dörner was traveling the country. Already he was there in the 30s. He was, it's an interesting story, he was an officer in the Wehrmacht, and he suddenly he disappeared in 1944, and he was in Commagene, and he waited there till 47 before he came back to Germany. Also, Dörner was very interested in Commagene for itself, and what is so important about his research is that he had a kind of longue durée approach. So he knew the landscape very well as an archaeologist, and he did research on prehistoric caves until Crusader castles and remains from the Middle Ages. When he was there in the 50s, he asked one of the local leaders if maybe interesting things were found in the last time. So as it goes in Turkey, you drink a lot of tea. And then the guy said, yeah, somebody found a strange letter. And then they went into the field, and the letter was over here on top, and then they start digging, and then you saw over this. And Dörner was very surprised because he knew this Greek text. This is also part of the Nomos. So you see, it's really a kind of program in which this king disseminates a kind of standardized text about himself and his kingdom over the whole area, over the whole region. The Germans started excavating in Archameia am Nymphaios, and there they found partly different things than at Nemrud Dağ, although probably here they reconstructed the fire altar over here, because if you have something Persian it needs to be Zoroastrian, you need a fire altar. Big statues over here, but also here there were a kind of what they interpreted as banqueting rooms, with beautiful mosaics being preserved. So we know that the big statues were there as well. You see here the find of a foot, and here wonderful material. I've never been able to trace it in the Museum of the Diamond, but and you see these are parts of, and they might be more Greek, between inverted commas. They might have been more lifelike, these statues. This is the reconstruction. So you went up the hill in a kind of processional roads. Then here were big banqueting rooms, maybe statues of the ancestors standing over here. And then here, clearly based without any evidence of the mausoleum of Halikarnassos, and the big row statues over here. We are not informed because it has been thoroughly cleaned, the area in late antiquity. So we know nothing about it. There's also another area. This is the text that Dörner found, and here was a big entrance and a stairway going down. The information we had and still have about Archameia is given in the Nomos. And in the Nomos, Antiochos says, Archameia was the city of my father, and I renovated the city of my father and made it anew because my father was so important, etc., etc. So for 20 years, the Germans have looked over there for the older phases, of course, of Mithridates. They did not find it. So there is no proof at all that Mithridates would be over here. Antiochos also says that I have my temple tomb over here, but the tomb of my father is in Archameia. And therefore, of course, the Germans, when they found this, they thought, now we have the tomb of Mithridates. So what did they do? They started excavating this tunnel, and the tunnel went down 20 meters, and then 40 meters, and then all of us would have stopped, but they are Germans, so they continued. So Dörner managed to get a kind of railway company who installed there a small railway which goes into the mines, like this. And after 123 meters and 30 centimeters, the tunnel stops, and there's nothing. And they're still puzzled. There's nothing. So we have this big text, this Nomos, there is a tunnel over here, so apparently it is important, but the tunnel goes nowhere. And we know that this was used because things archaeologically have been found. And of course we have the same thing again. Here a very important one, always because it's the best preserved, Dexiosis, used as how I think we should not approach the monument. And that is as a kind of incontro, the east meeting west, with this being east, of course, and this being west. So my point is, and I have a whole debate about this in my book, I think there is a big problem in terms of sources. years. So many historians claim that we know everything over here. We have the monuments, we have the epigraphy, so here we can come to a full-scale reconstruction, you could say. I think we know very little because we only have the information provided by the king. So we have one big project of propaganda. It's a very interesting theme, I think, in ancient history and archaeology in general. If you look about Pergamon, we believe still what the Pergamene dynast said about themselves in material culture and in text. The same thing is going on over here. There is very little documents to check what actually was going on. Do we have here a coming together of two different religions? What's happening? How should we account for the bricolage, the eclecticism we had over here? So as soon as I found out, well, this was for me the most important question, so therefore I focused on my book in that question. That does not say that Nemrud is not important for many other discussions, but that we will discuss when we arrive at the discontents. So Arsamaya, wonderful picture, the foot also being over here, and this, of course, is the famous tunnel that you still can visit. About the visibility of Nemrud Dağ, you see it's over here. We are here, we are on the plains, we are here about 50 kilometers away. So even if you would never have been there, the aura of the king would be very clear, especially because, as I said, the same set of material culture was visible on local cult sites which were distributed all over this small kingdom. And this is also kind of tumulus which is later, so we will not talk about it, called the Karakush. And over there, this later king Mithridates is buried. So you see that actually we have the same structure, so a tumulus with 3 terraces, but much more slimmed down. And here you see the visibility of Nemrud Dağ. Where then could we have more information about what is actually going on over here? If this is really a project of dynastic propaganda, well, then we should turn to, of course, the capital city, Samosata or Samosata. This was one of the most impressive huyuks in the Middle East. Probably you have still seen it. Yeah, I've not. So you see here the Roman aqueduct. So it's incredible how it has been preserved. But here you see the Atatürk barrage, and well, this is the situation. Okay, so this was Samosata with a kind of undisturbed stratigraphy from the late Bronze Age until the Middle Ages, and this is Samosata now. So sometimes as an excursion we hire boats, and then if you look underwater, it's very philosophical, romantic place, because if you look underwater you see Antiquity. But we cannot. There's nothing we can do there anymore. That's a pity. Because the later period is interesting. Here are the Roman aqueducts. But what is much more interesting is that this Samosata seemed to have been a kind of, well, I always call it a kind of Alexandria. Not at all being some kind of backwater, but showing that Antiochos and Commagene in general was a very central node in the Hellenistic world. They were very much aware of what was going on. How do we know this? We know this from excavations in the 70s. So Nismet Özgüç, who published at last in 2009, a big book with all the information on the excavations that she had done over the last 30 years. And there's a little bit on Samosata. Orhan Bingöl, who excavated there as a student, published a very, very small books with some photographs. So this is all the information there is. And what we are now doing in the Wiki program that Rahim mentioned, we have the authority, so the finds of these excavations are in the Museum of Adıyaman, and we have the authority to publish them and to study them. So we went to Ankara, to the archives of Özgüç, and we have that. And on the basis of the data of the excavations and the finds now in the Museum of Adıyaman, we can say quite a lot. Probably, we have no time to go in detail, but probably it was a very big, you could call it a palace. It's maybe a kind of villa. That's also probably, but it's 1,500 square meters, and it was decorated. Here you see a plan with wonderful mosaics and with actually the best stuff the Hellenistic world can bring you. So I realized this for the first time when I saw this. If you see, it's a kind of Silenos. This is the highest quality mosaic you can imagine. Actually, only comparable with the recent things the French found in Alexandria. So the mosaic with the dog, etc., etc. So it's an immense palace that has finds like these. So if you look, this is the highest quality, what we call Second Pompeian style wall painting. So even the Casa del Fauno in Pompeii, which was this big luxury late Hellenistic villa, has not something like this. And this is a very remarkable hat that would be wonderful for the exhibition, but which is now in Adiaman, that we have now republished. And it's very interesting because it's probably a portrait of Antiochos, but you will have recognized that the hairstyle is very Augustan. And here there is an inscription under the eye saying Antiocho. So maybe also there was a kind of ancestor gallery in the palace where they put these kinds of statues. So Samosata, nobody knows it now, Hellenistic Samosata, but this was really a place where all kinds of global connections came together. There are more sites like Achaemenid on the Euphrates, where we also have this big reliefs of. And this had to end our small tour, very well recognizable. Here you see the famous coins of Zeugma, recognizable by the very flat Acropolis, also very philosophical place, although of course a very sad story with the raising water. And the archaeologists, many international teams, a lot of French teams have worked over there, who really worked while the water was rising. Very interesting for us, but mainly finds from the later Roman period. So here you see them really doing the rescue work. But also from our period, here we see a Dexiosis. So this is that we know that it was also part of this Antiochian program. Okay, our very brief introduction into Commagenian archaeology. My last 5 minutes. How have people dealt with it? I already told you that they had great difficulties with it. These are two very revealing quotes. I didn't bring any Near Eastern scholars because that would be so. I take the blame for this as a classical archaeologist myself. Bert Smith in Oxford, a great scholar, and he says in his famous Hellenistic royal portraits, Antiochus' images then are a hybrid art designed to express his particular hybrid ideas. The result is a rather hollow synthetic Greek version of Oriental dynastic arts, which perhaps accurately expresses his vision. He would not have seen it like that. He hates it. And this becomes very much clear in his review of these German books. Antiochus I of Commagene suffered probably from both paranoia and megalomania. So this is how, and of course, Bert is a kind of extreme example of it, but everybody has these problems. We don't take it seriously for the reasons I just explained. And of course, for John Boardman, I will not read the quote, but it's not Greek enough. And if it's not Greek enough, it's not interesting. Now, I think, and this is what my book is mainly about, I will not dwell on that, but let me briefly say, my book is very basically about it. We need a different approach that takes bricolage seriously. And then we come back to Persianism. Now, one more quote from, what is still an intellectual hero, I think, Arjun Appadurai, who already in 2010, I think, says it very, very, very well, what we do wrong when we approach connectivity and antiquity. And this is why I started working on globalization to develop that. Appadurai says very clearly, the circulation of forms, Hellenism is one of those forms, Persianism may be another, produces new and distinct genre experiments, he says, many of which are forced to coexist in uneven and uneasy combinations. One lesson here, and that's very important, is that we need to move decisively beyond existing modes of creolization, hybridity, fusion, syncretism, and the like, which have largely been about mixture at the level of content. Indeed, we need to probe what he calls the cohabitation of forms, because they actually produce new contexts through their peculiar inflection of each other. Well, this is in one quote actually where my Nemrud Dağ book is about. We have a cohabitation of forms, and this cohabitation produces new contexts. And therefore we have to take it seriously as this new context. And now Mnemohistory and Persianism come in. So it's not about, did Antiochos portray the Achaemenid costume well or not? Or did he really understand what Heracles was about? That's a historical question. That's actually not an interesting question. The most interesting question, I think, is a mnemohistorical question. So why did he portray this Persian costume and the Persian gods, and why did he bring them together? What was his Hellenism about? And if we take this approach seriously, we also have to question to ask the question then, what was his Persianism about? Now, this is very interesting. So I told you, I will never forget the moment. I was walking in Leiden in 2011. Unfortunately, I did not know Ab de Jong yet, because he would have better answers for me then. But I was asking to my friend Frederick Narebout, a professor in ancient history, where is this book about Persianism? And he says, Persianism? I have no idea what you're talking about. If you want a book about Persianism, you should make it yourself. Huh? And if there is a challenge, Rahim knows I take it. So then I thought, then I'm going to make this book about Persianism, because it has to be there in one way or another. There is a very interesting debate about Hellenism, about what it means. So we have here a Roman general, earlier than Antiochus, who does something which is bizarre in terms of bricolage. We have a very veristic face that shows him as a general, and he has a very Greek athlete body that wants to underline his masculinity in a very different way, in a Greek way. So actually here also we have this cohabitation of forms, because this is very much Hellenistic Greek, and this is what we call Roman verism. And the best example, of course, is the Achaemenid altar. If you don't know it, you would think that these are two different monuments, but they were not. They were the same monument. And if you wanted to display a very serious official public ceremony of the Roman census, you did it in this style. But if you wanted to display a methodological scene, you did it in this style. So styles have become elements, semantic elements. So we should not look at styles historically and understand them as Greek or Persian historically, going back to authentic meanings, but we should understand them as semantic elements. This is not Hellenization of Rome. These are Romans choosing and picking from a Hellenistic repertoire certain elements. So it's not Hellenization, it's Hellenism. Now we also, this is also Hellenism in the Levant. What Greek culture, what we call Greek culture, means for the Jews has been very well explored. Here Herod's royal box. I mean, why does he display it like this? So Hellenism has been well explored. We can take that as an example to think about Persianism. Even also now, despite all the efforts by Egyptologists to block it, also Egyptianism has been very well explored. So from the moment the Ptolemies comes in Egypt, a very interesting acme of Egyptian art maybe comes into being, because for the first time we see all kinds of intermingling. Also there we see the semantic elements. This is Cleopatra, Egyptian, and this is Cleopatra, which we would call Greek, which has nothing to do with ethnic identity or cultural identity. No, they have become semantic elements. Style becomes an element in itself. The Ptolemies presenting themselves as pharaohs at the foot of the lighthouse. This is what was in Alexandria. So there is something like Egyptianism, which in the religious domain has been well explored. And therefore I think we should also start to take Persianism seriously. The ancient world is, the Hellenistic world is about much more than Hellenism alone. There clearly was Persianism, I think. Last time when I had the privilege of lecturing here, we saw this figure and this wonderful quote, which really says that the children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony were playing certain roles. And one of them, he was the habit of the successor of Alexander, and the other ones had the habit of the Medes and the Armenians. So I think that the Persian elements in the case of my Antiochus I at Nemrud Dağ are of course a reference to the Achaemenid kings. Every monarch in the Near East after the Achaemenids wanted to tie up, for reasons of legitimation, to this first universal empire. That was the big allure. So in a way, what happens at Nemrud Dağ is very comparable with what happens over here. So the Persian throne as the element of a kind of legitimation of power. Now my Antiochus was very innovative, I think, because he combined Hellenism and Persianism, and try to create this new context, this new visual language. So, and there I close, I think it's time to take Persianism and all the bricolage project it is part of seriously as Mnemohistory, in order to be able to study its Wirkungsgeschichte and its innovative potential. For the history of the ancient world, I truly think this is extremely important. As I found out in Nemrud myself, people cannot make sense of bricolage because they are locked up in one cultural tradition or the other. And therefore it's wonderful now that we are within this program together with classical archaeologists and with Near Eastern archaeologists. Let me be clear, I think this is the perspective, the Eurasian perspective. If we look Persianism very much in the West, we have of course Mithras. This might be a wonderful example for the exhibition. Mithras has nothing to... Of course, Mithras has a lot to do with Persia. But I think that the approach to Mithras is a mnemohistorical approach. It's about imagined Persia from the Roman period. My own book on Nemrud Dağ is still, of course, much too much Mediterranean. And that many Near Eastern archaeologists will hold that against the book. And I try to account for it. This is why I made Persianism and Antiquity, which is a little bit more already to this part. But let's look at this. Why in Falaka these elements are Persian? Why in all kinds of things from Central and Eastern Eurasia we find these Persian elements? We only will properly understand that, I think, if we try to account for that in terms of mnemohistory, and Persianism might be a way, a hypothesis to get there. With these words, I would like to thank you, and I would like, very importantly, to congratulate the Pourdavoud Center with this first anniversary. And I also hope to have shown, as a classical archaeologist, it was a big privilege to talk at this special day. But through the concept of Persianism, I think also the Pourdavoud is not only for the study of the Iranian world, but it's also for the study of the eternal return of Persia, under the guise of Persianism or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's one dissertation project that I keep hoping somebody will take up, and that's the incredible presence along the Euphrates. Almost every one of the sites, not just Samsat, has significant Persian and Hellenistic remains. Many of them are reported. So basically, they've never really been studied, and I'd congratulate you on getting access to the Samsat, which is, of course, the most important of the sites. But almost every single other site along the river between Birajek and the area to the north has Persian material. Yep. So we have to think that there was a major Achaemenid presence there. And the other thing I was thinking as you were speaking is that we have another excellent example of this with the Hittite, Neo-Hittite kind of interface that we have between the last half of the second millennium and the first millennium, where the Neo-Hittite kings are using and emulating, but also creating and incorporating new elements into their own imperial or semi-imperial capitals. So thank you very much for your talk. I'm sorry, no questions. I just enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's very much true, of course. There is a lot of rich material from the Persian periods, but also for the Hellenistic periods that we still have to deal with. So Tile Höyük, that you also will know, which is at the other side, still there. The volume about the Hellenistic period has not been published. So that's and that's also important, of course, for the very interesting questions that we also have been debating in Istanbul. I mean, I think that we have Persianism over here, but that does, of course, not rule out the possibility that you had Persians over here. And that's, of course, a very important question. So, were there Persian priests present over here or not? But there are very interesting parallels from the Egyptian world. So we know that in the 1st century BC, Egyptian priests could be religious specialists from everywhere who took on the role of Egyptian priests because that gave them certain advantages over other religious specialists. So that's a very delicate balance between, we talk here about Persian, but what actually do we mean when we say that over here? And then we see, I think, everything overlapping. So it's not ruling out that there was something Persian over here, but people have talked about pockets of Persian resistance to the Hellenistic world, and they see the monument like that. And then I think this multi-layeredness that you talk about, then I think we really have to imagine this world, and there, if you can call it globalization or connectivity or Eurasian perspective, I don't care. But the most important thing is that people were very much aware of cultural concepts. People were playing with all kinds of cultural concepts and ideas. So when we are really in the 1st century BC, I think then this mnemohistorical approach should play a very important role in our interpretation. But that does not rule out that, of course, ethnic and cultural identity interpretations might be valid here as well.
The lecture was excellent, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think the most important point is obviously that we have forms of hybridity, and these forms have to be now established as worthwhile entities that have the so-called Eigenrecht in a certain sense.
Yes.
But that is also an ontological question. It is a foundational question that they have, this form of hybrids have their own ontologies. They represent a form of being that is as valuable as other form of beings in a certain sense. And I don't know why you would require, what exactly the function of finding these forms of hybridity and explaining them as something which might be a beginning, a new thing, and certainly no less, no more than precedents. Why would you require the concept of mnemohistory here? If you can maybe just explain to me how you combine the mandate or the request to ontologically refound these forms of hybridity with the so-called receptivity that comes to the mnemohistory. So if you can explain that to me in your own ways.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this extremely fundamental question. That is simply, Rahim, because I think that in fact all societies or cultures, as we call them, are built up by bringing together different global elements and combining them in one specific locality. And a problem is that we do not see that often. So if you look, for instance, to the Roman world or Roman art, everything in the Roman world or Roman art comes from or the Etruscan world or the Egyptian world or the Greek world, but the moment it gets canonized and the moment that it becomes to have a life of itself, we call it Roman art, and apparently then we do not see the hybridity anymore. We apparently see the hybridity over here because it did not really develop into a tradition. But the ontological reason is that I think that every culture is actually a hybrid or eclectic from its very beginnings, because everything is taken from somewhere. So that should be our point of departure. Second important element, this is how I think societies, cultures work or function. At the same time, that is, and this is something that we see nowadays, very difficult to accept. Because cultures and societies also need this very strong form of eigenheid or identity. And what do? To convince themselves time and again of this eigenheid, that there exists something like the United States as a unique or the Netherlands, this is an immense symbolic discourse. And the symbolic discourse is mnemohistory. So the fact that there is a flag, that there is a national anthem, that there is a shared history, all those things, celebrations, memorial days, those are, in my view, all kinds of symbolic constructs that maintain the hybrid culture, because it's very difficult for us to deal with hybridity. So therefore, it is the mnemohistorical approach that works best. Because if you, and this is of course the famous concept of the invention of tradition, if you look if traditions are really true, traditions are never really true. All traditions are invented in one way or another. They always go back to something that somebody thought about reality. Hobsbawm Ranger, the invention of tradition. So their famous example are the wigs of the Scottish judges. For us, that's typically Scottishness, but the wigs of the English judges. And the typically Scottish kilts that would go back for millennia and millennia. So everything is taken from somewhere at a certain moment in time. That's the historical reality, but at the same time societies need a very big sense of identity, and therefore they make this whole big mnemohistorical construction about this is what we are. So those are the two poles, I think.
If I may push one more.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
so sorry,
yes,
forgive me, I don't want to impose
Was it
upon
clear
others. It was perfectly
Okay.
clear, but the only concern I have is that by mentioning that this form of hybridities have their own eigenheit, they have basically the right to establish something that exists on its own merits, you would somehow diminish that Eigenheit by putting it as part of a rezeptionsgeschichtliche Betrachtung, which is part of the mnemohistorical contemplation. So as a corrective where they are ultimately coming from, I understand that.
Yes,
but it will, if it is supplanting what you try to do, then it would diminish the value of this, in my view at least, it might diminish what you try to do with the form of hybridity as a new beginning.
Okay, then I think that we are arrived at this point where we were so many times in Istanbul, and which I liked very much, that we disagree fundamentally, Rahim.
Good.
Because I think it's much more important than what something is or becomes than where it comes from. So the fact that we have this idea that we always want to trace where things come from, that's of course wonderful, and it can explain something. But I think, especially in case of these monuments, it's much more interesting to locate the agency not from where things come from, but who makes what from different elements. So the fact that Antiochos takes Hellenism and takes Persianism and puts them together and wants to do something new with it, I think that is something that we should first try and explain. So the agency should be with let's say, the one who is making the bricolage. And we are always, it seems to be something very enlightenment thought, that you try to go back to where something originally came from. We always want to know, but where did it originally come from? But that's not so relevant if
Actually,
you want
we agree on that.
to understand.
We agree.
Okay, good.
So any other questions, maybe? Yes, I'm sorry, please.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful overview of all sorts of material about which I know very, very little, and I thank you for that. My question reveals my ignorance. I get it that you found the idea of Hellenism and Egyptianism as really useful, so sounding boards to create this concept of Persianism, which I really love. But as you quickly touched upon the Egyptianism, I realized that there, a contrast of evidence is they have text, sort of. I mean, historical texts that explain what these figures were doing, and you expressed frustration that all you have is a self-propagandizing statement which is hard to read. That aside, from what you present, I get the impression that there's a qualitative difference between, let's say, Egyptianism and Persianism as you present it at Commagene. And I'm wondering if you also see such a qualitative difference in how the past is being reworked in the present, how it's being presented in this new wonderful form.
Thank you, because that was too quick then, or I was not explicit enough. Of course, there is a very big difference, because the development of the concept we call Egypt is very different than the development of the concept we call Persia. So with Persia, and this is what the Persianism book really shows, and which I could never have done myself, because we have the overview of all the articles, is that it is kingship or a legitimation, royal legitimation, a universal empire, that people often refer to Persia for that reason. They refer to Egypt for very different reasons. So of course, so that has to do with the development of the concept over time, I think.
But the Ptolemaic example, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No.
The Ptolemaic example that you give is a wonderful one, because it's also a case of proprietorial, no, that's the wrong term, taking on assumption of tradition, if I can put it that way, on the part of a conquering force. Whereas the Commagene kings, I suppose, are more local stock, as it were, I say, again, because it's not exactly analogous. And so there's different ways of reaching to the past and to gauge strength of present claims.
Now, my idea is actually that the Commagene kings, but that's of course a discussion I have with Up. We know nothing about, really nothing about who they were. So they come out of nowhere. Ptolemaeus we have no other sources about. Even his father, Mithridates Kallinikos, we know very, very little about. And of course, Samos, his grandfather, everybody says, okay, of course, but it's Samosata, but the only mention of Samosata as Samosata is from the time of Antiochus. So I would not be surprised if this had a totally different name and if he had renamed. So my idea, but that's debatable, is that they came out of nowhere. You could also argue that they are Orontids, but they came out of nowhere because we have no idea. And therefore they need this legitimation. Yes. Because the interesting thing is, and the Persianism conference also showed this very clearly, the Seleucids, they had no reason to, they were in charge. And therefore they did not need this whole legitimation apparatus to show that they were entitled to rule, etc. If you are a local ruler coming out of nowhere, Antiochus had no big conquest at his name, so he could boast actually nothing. But still he wanted to show he was the ruler. So how do you do this? Well, therefore this big need of legitimation. That's my idea.
Thank you.
But of course the concepts, they develop very differently through time. So the concept of Greece developed very differently through the Hellenistic world. So if in Pergamon and in all these other contexts they would have used classical Athens for a different reason, the concept would have ended up differently in the Roman period. That's the idea.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think I might have to
Yes. Sure. I was too long already.
30 minutes late. I just got it here. Maybe 10 minutes of a pause, and then we just begin with I'm sorry for that.